So hello everyone who is listening in. I see there are 30 people online. We are talking about, in this session, in a panel about the 2G, 3G sunset in Europe and perhaps also further afield. And we have a great panel here to discuss this. I'll introduce them as we go along. Just by the way of an introduction, I just would like to say we already had some 2G and 3G switch-offs in Europe. For example, I think Sunrise was possibly the first one. We had AT&T, Verizon, we had in the Far East some switch-offs. So it is going on, and Vodafone, I think, announced that they'll switch off 3G in Europe during 2020-21. But there are a number of issues, and perhaps I start off by simply listing them. First of all, there are some benefits which, of course, operators can see. Spectrum is freed up for 4G or more particularly 5G. Costs are reduced. These are two obvious benefits, but there are a whole host of issues. What to do with legacy customers? Should 2G go first, 3G go first? What about the low penetration of VoLTE handsets if you no longer have circuit switch fallbacks? How is circuit switch fallback implemented in networks? Is it back to 2G or back to 3G? These are issues. And then not least the large number of M2M devices in products with a very long life and regulatory issues associated with that, for example, vehicles. And last, perhaps I can introduce something where we can learn from what's going on now and not to get into the same sticky situation when we're transitioning to 5G. And here I'm again talking about IoT. IoT is just at the beginning of the growth curve. Everybody is busy selling 4G IoT devices, which with a lifetime of perhaps 20 years, and I'm sure in 20 years, we won't have 4G anymore. So we might be able to look forward to that issue. So without further ado, I would like to invite Karin Thurberg, the Director of Wireless Product Management from Huawei, to tell us about the drivers and challenges for the 2G, 3G sunset. Over to you, Karin.
Thank you, Stefan, for the introduction, and hello to the audience. I'm very thankful to have the chance to meet despite the challenging situation. And as Stefan mentioned, I will introduce to you a Huawei perspective on the driving forces for shutting down 2G and 3G systems, and also some of the challenges that may slow this process down for a little while. And at the end, I will highlight some key measures that can help us stay focused on the right track. Next, please.
Can you put up the slide? Yeah.
So the 5G vision promises us significantly improved network capabilities, for example, capacity, speed, latency, and the ability to handle many concurrent users. And these will be used in different combinations by the 5G services, bringing huge potential for continued traffic growth. An equally important capability of 5G, and in fact of every next generation system, I would say, is the reduced cost per bit. And this is possible due to the higher spectrum and power efficiency of 5G that comes from an improved radio interface. We are introducing much better, higher orders of massive MIMO, and smarter algorithms for shutting down equipment when it's not actively transmitted. So if the cost per gigabyte can be reduced by a factor of 10, then the traffic can be allowed to increase with the same factor of 10 while maintaining the same production cost. And this is important since the operator's income has stayed relatively flat over the years. So my message here is that a fast and smooth modernization of the network by rolling out 5G is key to support the operator's business cases. So when modernization is then also combined with spectrum refarming and sunset of legacy technologies, the potential cost savings further increases. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see a schematic view of how such sunset may take place. So it's a stepwise approach. And 3G is particularly beneficial to shut down first, since the radio is more difficult to put to sleep in comparison to 4G and 5G. So what I'm saying is that when 3G is sharing radio with 4G and 5G, then the potential for power saving in 4G and 5G is somewhat reduced. Next slide, please. So we have touched upon the fact that the sunset is a long-term process that requires careful preparation and stepwise execution. Some of the key success activities that operators can and have done in the past include campaigns to inform users about the benefits of upgrading to 4G and 5G, eventually also supported by attractive offerings such as subsidized terminals or discounted tariffs for a period of time. And operators should also consider customized migration options to LTE-M or NB-IoT, or helping their M2M customers to migrate to other more specialized operators. And we will hear more about the specific actions that have been taken by the Asian operators, which have come further in this process in the coming session by Peng Zhao from GSMA. Next, please. So there are a number of challenges of different character that needs to be carefully managed. Number one, the 4G wide area coverage need to mirror the 2G coverage to minimize the situations where 2G will be required for voice fallback. And there are some good examples of how regulators have positively contributed to this. For example, ARCEP in France that has prolonged the 900 MHz licenses for free against 4G coverage build-out. So then there is a target that 80% of the European households shall have smart meters by 2023, and these fixed installations are all long-term contracts of some 15 or even longer, more years. And they are, to some extent, still relying on 2G and 3G coverage. And finally, there is an EU parliamentary decision that eCall, which is an emergency calling system for vehicles, shall be implemented in all member states. And this regulation covers 3 parts. So from 1st of March 2018, all new type-approved vehicles have to have an eCall modem. And then the public service answering points, that's the SOS alarm centrals, they must be prepared to manage these calls. And finally, the mobile networks must be ready to transfer them. And the current EU regulation says e-calls shall be transferred as prioritized emergency calls in the circuit switch networks, which we are trying to phase out. So this may become an issue over time as more vehicles get this feature, and we shall therefore hope that there will soon be a parliamentary decision in favor for the next generation eCall standard, which is ready. Next, please. So despite the challenges, we see that the situation is looking positive. So most devices already support LTE, and there's a range of them offered at attractive price levels. NB-IoT is gaining momentum. It's a narrowband solution, and that makes it easier to fit it into any unused part of the spectrum band. And then Volt-on is paying result for the activation levels. And I know that, for example, Telenor has very actively established Volt roaming agreements with other operators in Europe. Next, please. And now, this is my final slide. I first of all want to inject a spirit of hope. We will eventually come to a point where legacy technologies can be replaced by more spectrum and power efficient 4G and 5G deployments. But there is some collaborative work to be done between the car and the telecom industries and the policymakers at the European Commission. Since we have, I hope we have Kyriakos with us in this session, I would kindly like to ask for your support in raising this issue with the European Commission so that the current EU eCall regulation can be updated to include the next generation eCall standard that is based on 4G and IMS. And with this said, I would like to thank the audience and hand back to Stefan.
Well, thank you very much for that, Karin. This was certainly a very good overview over the issues we are facing. We'll take some questions at the end, but for now, I'd like to hand over to our next presenter, Peng Zhao from the GSMA, where he is a Senior Director for Spectrum. So, Peng, slides, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. You can hear me, yeah? Cool.
Yes.
thank you very much, Stefan, for the introduction, and I'd like to thank Huawei as well to organize this panel. It's certainly really timely for us, for GSMA. We see that the 2G and 3G switch off start, all over the world now. If I can just have the next slide, please. Oh no, this one is fine. Can you go back one? Sorry. So when we look at our membership base and we look at the different cases, and I think Stefan indicated there are a few cases in Europe and in US, but almost 80% or more of the commercial switch off has happened so far in APAC.
Yeah, he's gone.
We decided.
There's only 5 people including.
Sorry, there's some noise. Can't hear myself. All right. So we decided to do a report and look at the kind of different use cases. In APAC, where we interviewed 20 and something member operators who have decided to switch off 2G or 3G and come up with a report to inform our membership. That includes, mobile operators, but also could be a good information for regulator all over the world who is considering this case. So next slide, please. So in APAC, we looked at those 6 markets who has switched off. There are in total about 20 mobile operators, and we look at the kind of key drivers for why they decided to switch off at the moment they decided to, and also we look at the kind of the possible conditions that may raise from the suspending kind of dependent services, but also determining how did it determine the sequence of 2G and then 3G switch off. So on the key drivers first, those are the 5 key drivers that we recognized. One of the key one is, of course, the reuse of the spectrum for more efficient technologies. So refarming the 2G or 3G spectrum for 4G and 5G usage. As you all know, from 2G era, the spectral efficiency has increased almost by 100 times or 200 times to 4G and 5G now, and it's we always promote the most efficient usage of this really scarce resource, because our kind of member operators invest a lot to acquire those spectrum and want to make the most use of it. So the spectrum usage, of course, then some countries like Japan, they had other technology that was running on 2G network, the PDC back in 2008, 2009 time, and they decided to use that to switch off and use more kind of streamlined international standards. And then, of course, in some cases, the spectrum has been coming to the expiry of the 2G licenses, in the case in Singapore, and that's where all the 3 operators took the chance to, to decide to change to newer technologies. But of course, one of the key driver for mobile operator is cost optimization. It's really difficult to run 2, 3, or 4 different networks at the same time serving the same populations. It is really costly, both in the kind of maintenance, but also from the perspective of maintaining the hardware and software. Some of those equipments are coming to the end of life. So it is really kind of in the sense of rationalizing the cost of running network, and reducing the cost will reduce also the price for the consumers, of course. And finally, the last driver is, of course, the demand of 2G. 2G is most of the data consumption is on 3G and 4G nowadays, and 2G is kept for really little data traffic on them, and it's difficult to justify maintaining such an expensive network for very little data and revenue possibilities. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
Yeah. So I think I don't need to dwell too much on this one. I think this one I summarize a little bit mainly the kind of the cost, the potential cost reduction from the mobile operator side. But I think we can just jump to the last slide, please. Next slide. So the key lesson learned, and so what we see from the different cases of network switch off in APAC is that typically all those network shutdown and has been initiated by the operators, and this usually switch off at very different times depending even within the same market. But that's mainly depending on the user base, on the kind of the user base, whether they have mostly 2G network, 2G users, or whether they have many M2M users. One of the examples for the different timing is New Zealand. If you look at the reports, the first operator decided to switch off in New Zealand back in 2012, I think. The second operators decided to switch off in 2018, and the last operator announced they will switch it off in 2025. So within the same market, three operators have almost like 10, 12 years of difference when they switch off, mainly because especially the last operator have a large base of M2M. But which technology to retire really depends on the kind of the market circumstances as well. But again, it's really depending what is being used right now and whether it makes sense economically to maintain such a network. The full process generally takes 3 years time, and a lot of kind of consumer awareness campaign has been launched, and that's really definitely a recommendation for most of the operators and regulator. We seen in the report, when we did the report, that there were some cases of legal challenges when not enough time has been given to the consumer to switch. And finally, regulator does have a role to play in the case, either to help operator to inform the population, but also there are certain market or country where the spectrum is not yet technology neutral, and that's one of the key things that operator and regulator need to make available to operator to reform their spectrum. So with this, I conclude my presentation. I will share the link of the reports in the chat right now, and you can have a look, and I'm open to question later. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Peng. This was very informative, and it seems that in the countries you looked at, we had a market-driven approach, which seems to have delivered solutions appropriate for these countries. Next, we have Peter Agled, the Mobile Chief Network Architects for Telenor. So here we get an operator view with operations in both Europe as well as emerging markets. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for me to be able to participate in this this forum. Yes, I'm from Telenor, Norway, so I will give you a little bit insight from operator point of view, how we are thinking about this census of 2G, 3G. In our concept, we have been informed markets that we will shut down 3G in 2020, and also 2025 for 2G is kind of planned shutdown. But we see some challenges there. When it came to next slide, please. Thank you. When it came to technology, the spectrum is the resource all technology is addressing, and of course low band for coverage and high band for capacity. This is equal more or less for each technology that we introduced. Now we see that 4G and upcoming 5G is addressing the need for spectrum. And legacy technologies like 2G and 3G, they are more or less dominating the lower part of the spectrum. As we see that 4G and 5G is addressing also a higher part of the spectrum. Please, next slide, please. But there is a kind of change in how the spectrum is, the availability of the spectrum. If you see the lower part of the spectrum, there is a limited availability of capacity. When it came to high band, it's more available kind of bandwidth in terms of resources. And of course, this make as 2G and 3G is addressing much of this lower band because of coverage need, we have some struggling in this band in terms of introducing both 4G and 5G. So what we see is that there is a need for doing smart planning to be able to utilize this lower part of the spectrum in terms of being able to utilize this spectrum also for the upcoming technologies. As you know, in more the band above 1 gigahertz, we all already have kind of a good footprint of 4G with use of 1800 and 2600, while 3G is still kind of dominating the 2100 band. And also, of course, when we do radio planning, we need to reflect this kind of situation in how we are building and planning when introducing new technology. Next slide, please. And with this background, we're told you that there is a limited number of kind of resources in the lower band. This lower band has a huge network value, both for indoor coverage and outdoor coverage. And this is because we need to utilize this lower band to be able to reuse the site grid that we already have implemented with previous 2G and 3G. And as all operators know, this site acquisition to be able to build new sites is very extremely expensive, and it's difficult to for site act and therefore introduce new technologies. And also this low band is very important to be able to also gain coverage indoor, outdoor for new speech services like you have in Volte, and also voice over new radio when we introduce 5G later on. This mid band is kind of also important in terms of it's a squeeze between coverage and capacity. But also this band is of course important to be able to utilize for the new technology that we want to introduce with 4G. And of course, to be able to utilize this frequency reforming is the key to be able to introduce 4G and 5G in this different bands. So the circuits that the blue circles is indicating the value we have in our network in terms of the value of this low band, and it's highly needed in terms of being able to build costly and effectively. Next slide, please. So, see from a kind of architecture point of view, this is how we actually is needed to build the next generation base stations. We need to take into account 2G and 3G into this, with use of common radios or techno-agnostic radio equipment. We can be utilized the same radio equipment both for 2G, 3G, and 4G and 5G. Antennas also need to be reused across different technologies and also technology bands, because again, this installation require kind of site deck, and also the antenna is a huge challenge to have a proper place in the mast and on the rooftop in terms to be able to give the coverage that is needed also for the new technologies, and also to build this network, you need to ensure that you are able to move traffic between different frequency bands on different technologies. So when we then introduce a new technology, for instance, in the 900 band, the terminal will automatically discover the new technology when we switch on, for instance, 4G in the 900 band. This is the way we think it's smart to build for to be able to do smart refarming. And this is also maybe a high introduction cost when we start to modernize the network. But in the long run, we see this as the most cost-efficient way to be able to gain the flexibility of technology and also to refarm frequencies between the technology when it's needed. Yeah, next slide, please. But when it came to the concept of 2G and 3G, it's not all about radio and spectrum. I think it was mentioned earlier. We have some older issues. If you look on the 2G and 3G technology, they have two different core, the data core and the voice core. When it came to 4G and 5G, there is one core. So, for instance, voice, circuit voice, when they do refarming and shut down 2G and 3G, the voice has to be carried out by VoLTE or voice over new radio based on the IMS. This is the telco grade voice. It's not OTT voice, and it's important to have this service available because this is a requirement for our society. We have the machine-to-machine, what is today is dominating totally by 2G. We need to speed up the transition to IoT and LTM to be able to kind of able to do 2G and 3G shutdown. And also this CS fallback, which is today's kind of voice services for non-VoLTE terminals. This will be not be available when we do 2G and 3G sunset. And the last thing that is very important is the roaming regime. We today have quite a good roaming regime for 4G. I think data 4G roaming is well implemented, but what we're missing is voice. VoLTE roaming is very important to start to implement and be available between operators. This is kind of one of the main kind of things that is we need to address in terms of being able to also serve the voice when we have a 2G and 3G sunset. This is a cooperation between operators, so this needs to be kind of have more focus than we have today. And we have this machine-to-machine, which is also today dominating by 2G, and there is a lot of 2G roaming devices, and this need also to be kind of be supported by the 4G with the or upcoming 5G with IoT and LTM. Yes, I think I've used my time, so this is a short introduction how we as operator is addressing the 2G and 3G sunset. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you for that. A very specific operator view and the challenges in Norway and the solution, smart refarming. So next, I'd like to invite Kyriakos Braxovanidis, Deputy Head of the Unit Smart Cities and Sustainability of DG Connect. So over to you. Have you lost him? Oh. We seem to have lost him. Let's see whether James can get him back.
Hi guys. Yes, he seems to have come in and come out, and then I think we've lost him again. So one of my colleagues is trying to speak with him to see if we can get him back in. But if maybe we could start with the Q&A with regards to the 3 presentations we have already heard, and then if I can get him back in, then he will come. But I'm just conscious that we still need to finish it in around 15 minutes. So if I can get him in, we will. But yeah, if you feel free to start on the Q&A, and I'll do my best to get him in.
Right. Don't have any questions from the audience yet. So here's a question on my own, and maybe for Petter. You have mentioned 4G, 5G roaming for data, voice, and maybe also M2M. So what is the progress in Europe on for example, 5G roaming?
Yes, I think 5G roaming is a little bit ahead of us, but as we now see more and more kind of upcoming operators is introducing 5G roaming. As you know, in the beginning, you will have non-standalone. So as long as you have non-standalone, the existing 4G roaming will kind of take care of that one. But I think when it came to roaming, I think it's most important in terms of this sunset setting. I think the roaming is need to have more attention than we have seen today. I hope we'll see that will speed up. We have started to do some tests in Norway, but it's not far off good enough. We need to get more of this in place also for the rest of the operators.
Great, thanks for that insight. Now we have got Kyriakos back on screen, back in the session, so that's great. So I'd like to, so I already introduced you as the Deputy Head of Unit Smart Cities and Sustainability for DG Connect. So please start your presentation. James, if you could, do you have any slides? If perhaps, James, can you bring up the first slide, please?
No slides for Kyriakos.
Okay, all right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, weakly. Maybe you can make it a little bit.
Okay, I'll try. I'll try to speak louder.
That's better.
Okay. Thanks very much. I really apologize for this connection problems. I'm actually in the radio spectrum unit. I'm the deputy head of unit in the radio spectrum unit. Smart cities and sustainability was in my previous life, but it helps because it used to do with mobility at that time, and we see now this interplay between the e-call and the sunset of 2G, 3G, which is an interesting aspect. So just to share a few remarks on my side, just to say what is the regulatory framework, and that's what we are looking at in the Commission. So the three main bands that are involved are the 900 megahertz, 1800 megahertz, and 2100 megahertz bands. We are looking to those bands. We have a CPT action that is ongoing, that is looking to new conditions, less restrictive conditions concerning the use of the 900 and 1800 bands. And we have a study that is looking to the current and prospective uses of the 900 megahertz band. So the first question is, what's the regulatory status of the above bands? I think that interesting here are the 900 and 1800 bands, which go hand in hand. And there are three steps, three milestones in those developments. We have 1987, where we have the GSM directive on the 900 megahertz band. Then in 2009, we have the modification of the above directive to include systems which can coexist with the GSM. At that time, we only had the UMTS system. And then in 2011, we had a further decision that permitted LTE and WiMAX to also operate in the 900 and 1800 megahertz bands. And we are more or less in the situation of today. So in the context of the above decisions, we have that GSM services are protected in the 900 megahertz band from interference by any other technology that may be introduced into that band. It's worth noting here that GSM standard itself can only operate in the 900 or 1800 megahertz bands, in Europe at least, in no other band. And as such, whilst operators have the flexibility to introduce 3G or 4G services into a range of bands, the same is not true for GSM, meaning that if we want to maintain GSM services, we really have to maintain this directive. Regarding the 2100 megahertz band, the Commission has recently adopted on the 6th of May 2020 an implementing decision that amended the harmonized technical conditions of early decisions in order to make this band fit for 5G use. Question number 3, what are the current licensing and use conditions of the above bands in Europe? Most licenses for the 900 and 1800 bands were awarded in the early 1990s, following in general a technology neutral approach. The expiry dates range from 2020, some operators in Belgium, to 2040, if I recall, in Finland. Some countries, however, in this period have already refarmed the above bands to permit easier implementation of broadband technologies for 3G and more recently for 5G, notably by giving operators multiples of 5 MHz blocks, and also relicense the bands. This means two important things. Because a license is due to expire in a certain year, it does not mean that there will continue to be GSM service available in that band until the expiry of the band. As we saw, refarming and relicensing happened in many cases. And second is that any repeal of the technical protection currently provided by the GSM directive is expected to create only marginally less restrictive conditions for migration to new technologies, rather than incentivize operators to change technology or bandwidth for providing those services. These are two important elements to consider in the legislative process. Quick question. Who are the main stakeholders and interests concerning the GSM and UMTS used in the above bands? We have first of all the MNOs, the operators, who see in general, and this is elements of the study that we are funding, no impact when it comes to removing or maintaining priority in the context of the GSM directive, as long as regulator does not impose them to continue providing the GSM service. The MNOs highlight that the CPT report confirms compatibility in this context between GSM and 5G, meaning that there are no barriers to deploy next generation services in the band. The other big category are the automotive industry stakeholders, and mainly there the focus on the e-call. There we have the opposite side, that there is a strong voice to maintain the 2G, 3G networks, given the existing number of vehicles that are equipped with 2G, 3G based e-call systems, the lifetime of the vehicles today, 15 to 20 years, and some limitations of the current e-call legislation, which again make this a major issue for the automotive industry to maintain for a period of time these 2G, 3G networks. And of course, we have the public interest machine-to-machine services, and here the main focus is on smart meters, where the distribution service operators of energy have an expectation that GSM services will continue to be provided for the next some 15 years. However, the situation is different there because rollouts as from 2020 already incorporate alternative connectivity, so a newer connectivity. So concluding, it appears that the e-call in particular emerges as an important issue concerning the continuation or the switch off of 2G, 3G networks in Europe. This is also linked to the current legislation on e-call and the reference there to specific standards that make use of the 2G, 3G telecommunication networks for the communication and transmission of data between the vehicle on the one side and the emergency call centers on the other. What the Commission is doing is that we are looking to the overall regulatory framework. It can't be separated. So not only the spectrum framework for 2G, 3G networks, but also the e-call framework, and we will revise as appropriate as necessary the legal framework. Important inputs in this process, as we said, is the CPT work that is currently ongoing. They are expected to deliver by mid-2021 on the on making more or making 5G fit the 900 and 1,800 megahertz bands, as well as the study on the use of the 900 megahertz band. The other important thing that we should not forget here is that 4G networks is the environmental aspect apart of all economic aspects and so on, that also creates some pressure, let's say, in finding solutions there. We have that 4G networks are roughly 5 times more energy efficient than 3G and 50 times more efficient than 2G networks. Network infrastructure providers and operators are also projecting that 5G could be up to 10 to 20 times more energy efficient than 4G by 2025, 2030. So I believe that this topic might also be a topic of the conference next year. Thank you.
Right. We've got, thank you very much, Kyriakos, for the insight from the European regulatory perspective. Maybe I can just immediately follow that up with a question. What are the next steps the European Commission is considering with regards to 2G, 3G switch off?
Okay, so thanks for the question, Stefan. I mean, this is a question that all the stakeholders want to really to hear. So I think at this moment we don't have. I can't give you a time plan on which legislation is going to be revised when. But we are trying to collect, let's say, all the evidence that we can. So we have the CPT work that is looking to the two main bands, 900 and 1,800 band. We are also having the study on the use of the current use of the 900 megahertz band. And we are also, I mean, different departments of the Commission, my colleagues in DG Move, they have a forum where they try to introduce, the e-call, and there is similar activity regarding the machine-to-machine services in the context of energy. I mean, so what I would like to say is that without being a final conclusion, but this is, where discussions are so far going, and please don't take it as a Commission position, I mean, at this stage, is that it appears that, yes, there is a need to see some aspects in the legislation, particularly, as some legislation might be quite old, like, as we said, the e-call legislation makes specific reference to technologies, and this creates a number of questions on how this legislation should be interpreted, if it obliges the operators to maintain their networks just because it's mentioned in a secondary legislation, because it's in a secondary legislation. So we are looking to that aspect. But important also, and it goes hand in hand with the legislation, is that there is agreement between the stakeholders. I mean, I don't think that we can expect that the magic solution will happen from one day to the other and we'll say, okay, so from next year we can switch off all 2G, 3G networks. It really needs to be a kind of a grace period, a kind of a migration period that should be agreed between the operators on the one side and the main users on the other side. And the legislation should be there to help this migration without, let's say, prolonging any situation that might be inconvenient, let's say, to implement it.
Thanks for that. I think this raises an important point, which brings me to Peng and the example from New Zealand, where you saw a 12-year period between the first switch off and the last switch off. And you mentioned, Peng, that the drivers were really cost optimization and spectrum related in those countries in APAC. Maybe you can, is there anything specific we can learn for the European situation?
I think, yeah, it's definitely, Oh, can you hear me? Am I on mute?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry. So definitely in the case of New Zealand.
Okay.
You cannot hear me? Sorry. So in the case of New Zealand, it's definitely driven by the best usage of the spectrum. Can you hear me? Or sorry, I'm confused.
Yes.
Okay. But as Kyoko mentioned, the energy efficiency is definitely another point as well. But the key thing still for the mobile operator is the reuse of the spectrum. It is. I mean, we're looking at the spectrum of today for 5G, 4G, 5G. We even go into C band and also millimeter wave band. But when we see there are key bands, below 900, in 900 megahertz or 1800 megahertz, that's prime spectrum that can be reused for services, on broadband services. It's definitely, we see that as a waste not to keep that just for 2G customers. That is really dwelling. And in Europe, we see that the number of 2G customers and 3G customers are going down. In some of the countries, it's already less than 1%. In Switzerland or Australia, for example. But the other markets, like the Netherlands or Norway, they have some slightly different user base, where they have less 3G than 2G nowadays. So it's definitely things that the same kind of trends. So I think operators in Europe definitely already have plans to switch off some of those networks as well for spectrum and energy usage.
We just have 30 seconds left. I just wanted to give the floor again to Karin. Can vendors do something to smoothen the migration?
Yes, definitely. And as a vendor, we are really trying our best to facilitate the shift towards new generations of the wireless standards. So, for example, we are providing very powerful equipment that support all RATs. So we have basebands that support the entire range from 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and also NB-IoT. And we have radios supporting multiple bands, and also the antenna support all of the 2G and 3G and 4G and also the C-band spectrum, etc., etc. And we also have advanced software features. For example, spectrum sharing is a very good way to slowly introduce 5G in existing bands, but we also have sharing between GSM, UMTS, and UMTS LTE and GSM LTE as well.
Great.
So,
so there are options for operators to smooth that. I don't really have the time to sum up, but I hope this was interesting for the audience and also for the panel. And thanks, Peng, for sharing that report. And with that, we can all say goodbye, I suppose, and return to the main conference.